The image that I decided to use on the first slide is by Honoré Scherer. You can find it in the Museum of Modern Art in New York City. It was painted in 1943 and it's called Workers and Paintings. One of the reasons that I chose it is that it shows a series of essentially working class people holding various famous works of art. And if you look at the relationship between the works of art and the people holding them, you see that the artworks are portraying kind of visual metaphors conveying ideas of how people should think of their lives or might think of their lives. And yet, as the people or children look at these artworks, you can't but help notice that there is a discrepancy between what the visual metaphors are conveying in the artworks and the reality that the people are facing in the painting. Of course, one of the ironies here is that the artwork itself, which shows workers and paintings, is also conveying a certain kind of idea about what real life is like. It itself is a visual metaphor. One of the underlying ideas in my teaching, in all of the classes that I teach, is that critical and creative thinking starts with the unknown and with the unfamiliar. If you already know something, there's no reason to think creatively or to think critically about it. So the realm of the unknown is the realm of critical and creative thinking. With that in mind, I'd like to do a thought experiment, an experiment that we conduct in our imaginations or in our heads. So there are 3 parts to this thought experiment, and then I'm going to have some follow-up questions or commentary. I hope you're ready for this. So first, using your imaginations, I'd like you to imagine a world of pure sound. All right? To help with your imagining this, there are no objects in this world. There are no people. There are no buildings. There are no colors. Just sound. It might be like a dream somehow that you've had. What would you be like in such a world? All right? And if you're having a problem imagining that world, what's making that difficult? So that was the first experiment. Imagine a world of pure sound. The second part of this thought experiment is as follows. Picture what it looks like when you get up and drive into school or drive into work in the morning. Just take a minute to picture what that looks like. Getting up, getting out of bed. Some people might grab breakfast the first thing or skip breakfast and run out the door. Some people might take a shower, then get on the road. Some people will encounter maybe a traffic jam of some kind or smooth sailing. Maybe you'll have a problem finding a place to park. Anyway, the idea here is that you're picturing yourself getting up, going to work, or going to school. Finally, in our thought experiment, I'd like you to picture yourself or imagine yourself riding on a beam of light. Can you do this? Picturing yourself riding on a beam of light. Can you see yourself going 299,792,558 meters per second on a light ray? Is it harder than picturing yourself driving to work? Well, actually, I lied to you. We're going to try one more. Picture a square. Now, take your 2-dimensional square and give it 3 dimensions. Turn it into a box. Turn it into a cube. So you have a 2-dimensional square, and now you've made it into a box or a cube. You're art students, you know how to do this. Now, take your 3-dimensional cube and take it into 10 dimensions. What would a 10-dimensional cube look like? So now I have a few questions to ask. What makes picturing a 10-dimensional cube harder than picturing a 3-dimensional cube? You have a 10-dimensional cube on one hand, a 3-dimensional cube that you've probably learned how to draw in, say, drawing 1 when you're looking at linear perspective. What makes picturing the 10-dimensional cube harder than picturing what a regular 3-dimensional cube looks like? What makes imagining yourself riding on a beam of light harder than picturing yourself driving to work? Are either of these easier than imagining a world of pure sound. There are several things that these thought experiments have in common. First, they all have the unknown or the intangible as kind of an element in them somewhere. They all ask us to change our frame of reference from beyond the ordinary to the extraordinary. They ask us to alter the conceptual constants, the conceptual parameters, and the variables that we normally use to understand the world. And to different degrees, they all demand that we use a different thinking framework or a different system of cognitive mappings to reason about each of these challenges. So, let me explain a little bit more. Chances are that you found the second thought experiment the easiest, partly because it involves movement through space. And that's an experience that we're all familiar with. We walk, we run, we dance, we feel the wind blowing past us. Even simple movements such as lifting our arms or turning our heads gives us a sense of moving through space. So the first part of that, just picturing yourself getting up and driving to work, is something that's very familiar. These experiences give us a starting point, an initial context that we can map onto a new situation. All right? So the frame or reference, our experience of moving through space, suggests a possible framework for thinking about what it is like to, in this case, ride on a beam of light, something that we have not yet done. The idea of moving through space becomes a constant, something that is the same in both the real world and in the thought experiment, both in the real world of thinking about ourselves, getting up and driving to work, and the thought experiment of riding on a beam of light. What changes is how we move through space, and those are the conditions or the parameters, and what we experience. All right, so for instance, how fast we're going. In contrast, we don't have a starting point in the first thought experiment, the one where I ask you to imagine a world of pure sound. We don't have a starting point because we immediately trip over a fundamental question, which may not be obvious at first. Our experience of sound is mediated by space, since sound is produced by modulating the air around us. So, does a world of pure sound have a spatial dimension? Does it have an up and down? Does it have a left and right? Does it have a near and far? Sound is a function of molecules vibrating through space. But it is also a mental phenomenon, something that occurs in the neural wiring of a brain. So, before imagining a world of pure sound, we need an image of what space would be like in a sound world. But we can't transfer or map our everyday experience into the sound world because we're not sure how to strip away color and shape and touch from the concept of space. So color and shape and touch all seem to be bound up into the concept of space. In short, we don't know what to keep as conceptual constants between the real world and the imaginary sound world. Can a world of pure sound exist without the third dimension? To answer this question, we need more information about what a spaceless world might be like, and since none exist, we'll need to make a conjecture, a guess about a world having this quality, and then see if that guess can lead us to maybe more information. In the last thought experiment, a similar problem arises. Our everyday experience of space is three-dimensional, or four-dimensional if you include time as a dimension of space. We lack a frame of reference for imagining a 10-dimensional cube, a 10-dimensional space, unless you might happen to be a theoretical physicist on the side. So in this case, we lack both a frame of reference and a system for mapping one concept onto the other. And what I mean by that is if we think about a three-dimensional cube and a 10-dimensional cube, we can't really find anything that we can hold as a constant that can help us map our experience of a three-dimensional cube onto a 10-dimensional cube. So we kind of lack that frame of reference for understanding one in terms of the other. And so we don't have a system for mapping these concepts onto each other. All of this has to do with visual metaphor in the following way. visual metaphor, or metaphor in general, is a system of mapping. We take one thing and try to understand it in terms of something else. For instance, at the start of this presentation, I offered the metaphors of up is good and down is bad. But our lives are full of these kinds of metaphors. So let's take a look at a few more examples before we get into the nuts and bolts of what a visual metaphor is. I'm going to ask you to take a minute to look at these examples and to see if you can figure out what the underlying metaphor for all of these examples is. There's a root metaphor that allows us to kind of understand all of these examples on the screen. So, as a reminder, a metaphor lets us understand one thing in terms of another. That goes for whether the metaphor is visual or whether the metaphor is something that we use in everyday speech. So, take your claims are indefensible. He attacked every weak point in my argument. His criticisms were right on target. I demolished his argument. I've never won an argument with him. You disagree? Okay, shoot. If you use that strategy, he'll wipe you out. He shot down all of my arguments. What do you think the underlying root metaphor for all of these examples might be? If you came up with the root metaphor being argument is war, or is like a war, you got it. Your claims are indefensible. The idea of a defense, or not being able to defend something, comes from this idea of what happens in war. Or he attacked every weak point in my argument. We understand that sentence in terms of the root metaphor of an argument is somehow like war. You disagree? Okay, shoot. If you use that strategy, he'll wipe you out. Let's try another one. Okay, let's try another one. You're wasting my time. This gadget will save you hours. I don't have the time to give you. How do you spend your time these days? That flat tire cost me an hour. I've invested a lot of time in her. I don't have enough time to spare for that. You're running out of time. You need to budget your time. Put aside some time for ping pong. Is that worth your while? Do you have much time left? He's living on borrowed time. You don't use your time profitably. I lost a lot of time when I got sick. And finally, thank you for your time. What could be the underlying root metaphor for all of these expressions? So it looks pretty clear that the underlying root metaphor here is time is money, as we see in such expressions as you're wasting my time or I've invested a lot of time in her.